Remember when your dad dropped a wrench in the garage and yelled, "Jesus, Murphy," instead of something that'd get him in trouble? There was a time in Canada when swearing had guardrails. We had our own vocabulary of safeish oaths that let you blow off steam without scandalizing the church ladies or getting the soap treatment. These weren't American imports or British holdovers, they were ours, rink-rat insults, hardware store dad-isms, and TV-friendly brushoffs that walked the line between polite and punchy. Today we're cracking open 15 forgotten Canadian swear words nobody uses anymore. Whether you heard hoser on SCTV, caught your mom muttering "holy doodle" when the Leafs blew another lead, or remember when takeoff was the ultimate comeback, you're about to take a nostalgic trip through Canada's milder side of profanity. Which ones do you still hear echoing? Jesus, Murphy. Picture a kitchen in Scarborough, 1972. Your mom's on the wall-mounted phone with the coiled cord trying to balance the receiver under her chin while she stirs something on the stove. The mixing bowl slips. Batter everywhere. "Jesus, Murphy," she shouts, loud enough that Mrs. Kowalski next door probably heard through the window. This was the go-to exasperation for Catholic and Irish Catholic households across Canada. It kept you just clean enough. You weren't taking the Lord's name in vain directly, you were invoking some guy named Murphy, plausible deniability for the devout. The phrase shows up in Canadianism roundups and old newspaper columns as quintessentially ours, borrowed from Irish immigration patterns and adapted to Canadian sensibilities. It mattered because it gave people an outlet. You could be frustrated, you could be shocked, you could be genuinely upset, and this phrase carried all that weight without crossing the line your parents or the parish priest drew. Why did it vanish? By the 90s, it sounded old country, quaint. Youth slang shifted hard toward American imports and eventually internet culture. Nobody wanted to sound like their grandmother when they stubbed their toe. The phrase became a punchline instead of a reflex, and slowly it disappeared from everyday vocabulary. Holy doodle, Saturday night, hockey night in Canada, 1985. Your dad's in his chair, beer in hand, watching the Habs take on the Oilers. Gretzky threads a pass that shouldn't be possible. Your dad sits up. "Holy doodle, did you see that?" This was hockey dad language, arena safe, broadcast friendly. It carried surprise and admiration without making the ref look over. Wiktionary still lists it as a Canadian exclamation of surprise, particularly tied to sports culture. It's the kind of phrase that would show up in lower thirds on TV broadcasts when they wanted to capture authentic fan reaction without bleeping anything. It worked because it was ours, not borrowed from Britain, not copied from American sitcoms, just a goofy-sounding Canadian way to say "holy cow" or "holy smokes," but with that extra bit of regional flavor that made you feel like part of the club. It disappeared because it sounded square. By the time YouTube and streaming took over, authentic outbursts needed to be rawer or funnier. Holy doodle was neither. It was earnest, and earnest doesn't survive irony culture. The phrase still pops up in retro hockey montages, but nobody under 50 says it without a wink. Holy jumpin'! You're at your uncle's garage, helping him change the oil on his Dodge 1979. He drops the oil pan, black sludge everywhere. "Holy jumpin'," he yells, then catches himself and adds "Jehoshaphat" for extra emphasis, like doubling down will somehow make the mess less bad. These euphemistic explosions were everywhere in mid-century Canada. They're part of a whole family of holy formulas, designed to let you dodge blasphemy while still venting. Green's Dictionary of Slang tracks "holy jumpin" as broadcast-era language, the kind of thing AM radio hosts and sports announcers could use without getting letters from church groups. The phrase mattered because timing was everything. The double punch of "holy jumpin" had a rhythm. It worked in conversation, it worked on air, it worked at the card table and the fishing camp. It was theatrical enough to feel satisfying, but clean enough for mixed company. Why'd it die? It feels vaudeville old now. Comedy moved away from that kind of exaggerated performative surprise. Modern swearing is either brutally direct or wrapped in 3 layers of irony. There's no room for jumpin' Jehoshaphat in a world where people communicate in memes and 4-letter words. Cripes, lunch break at the factory, somewhere in Hamilton, 1968. The vending machine eats your quarter. You smack the side. Nothing. Cripes, you mutter, loud enough that the guy next to you laughs because he just lost a dime to the same machine. This was lunch pail language, office language, shop floor language, a softened version of Christ that let blue-collar Canada blow off steam without getting written up or making the secretary uncomfortable. It wasn't uniquely Canadian, but it was everywhere here. Manufacturing towns, resource camps, loading docks, and construction sites. It mattered because work had rules. You couldn't swear at your foreman, you couldn't swear around clients, and you definitely couldn't swear if the owner's wife was visiting the floor. Cripes was the release valve, mild enough to be safe, sharp enough to mean something. It vanished because politeness norms loosened. By the 90s, workplaces either tolerated real swearing or banned it outright. The middle ground where cripes lived just disappeared. Younger workers didn't inherit it. It died with the generation that needed it, replaced by either silence or actual profanity. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Friggin'. You're in a kitchen in St. John's, 1981. The power's out again. Your neighbor comes over with a flashlight. Frig, B, that's the 3rd time this month. It's not quite swearing, but it's not swearing. It's the space in between where Newfoundland English lives. This was Atlantic Canada's durable euphemism. Particularly strong in Newfoundland and the Maritimes, frig let you skirt the F-bomb while still getting your point across. Suitcase and Heels calls it out as a regional identity marker, something that separated Newfoundland speech from mainland Canadian English. You could say it on the CBC. You could say it at the church potluck. You could say it in front of your grandmother, and she'd probably say it right back. It mattered because it was code. If you used frig, you were probably from the Rock or the Maritimes. It was a linguistic handshake, a way of signaling where you came from and what community you belonged to. It hasn't completely vanished regionally, but nationally it reads as cute or dated now. Broadcast TV doesn't need euphemisms anymore because streaming platforms just let people swear. The cultural function of frig dissolved when the line between TV language and real language disappeared. It survives mostly as nostalgia or regional flavor in tourism marketing. Hoser, The Rec Room, 1983. You and your buddy are watching SCTV. Bob and Doug McKenzie are on, wearing toques, drinking beer, calling each other hoser every 30 seconds. You both crack up. By Monday, half your school is calling each other hoser. It's the insult of the year. This word exploded nationally because of SCTV. Before Bob and Doug, hoser existed in limited Toronto area slang, possibly connected to street hockey or ice rink maintenance. The Canadian Encyclopedia and Wikipedia both trace its popularization to around 1981, when the Mackenzie brothers made it a catchphrase. Suddenly, it was everywhere. Newspaper headlines, comedy albums, t-shirts. It mattered because it was ours. A uniquely Canadian insult that somehow felt affectionate and cutting at the same time. Calling someone a hoser meant they were a small-time loser, a goof, a lovable idiot. It wasn't mean enough to start a fight, but it wasn't exactly a compliment either. It died because it became a caricature. Once something becomes a national stereotype, it stops being useful as actual language. Younger generations don't have the SCTV reference point, so hoser just sounds like a dad joke. It's a costume, not an insult. It lives on in Canadian gift shops and retro merchandise, but nobody under 40 uses it seriously. Take off. Same rec room, same year. Your little sister won't stop bugging you. Take off, eh? You yell, mimicking Bob and Doug perfectly. She rolls her eyes but leaves. Victory. This was the TV-friendly brush-off. Cleaner than get lost, way cleaner than what you actually wanted to say. It worked on broadcast TV in the 80s because it was just vague enough. Word reference forums discuss it as milder than F-bomb equivalents, something you could say on family television without getting censored. It mattered because it had edge without consequences. You could tell someone to take off at school and not get sent to the principal. You could say it at home without getting in trouble. It walked the line perfectly. It vanished because the cultural scaffolding disappeared. Once SCTV faded, take off lost its comedic weight. Without the reference point, it just sounds like weird phrasing. Why would you tell someone to take off when get lost or go away work fine? The phrase became retro kitsch, something people say when they're doing their Canadian accent, not something anyone actually uses. What in blazes? Your grandfather's farm outside Regina, 1975. The gas can's missing from the shed. He stands in the doorway, hands on his hips. What in blazes happened to my jerry can? Nobody knows. The blazes hangs in the air like he's genuinely asking what in hell happened, but keeping it clean. This was Victorian-era language that hung on in prairie and rural Canada decades longer than it should have. Blazes is a euphemism for hell, something you could say in mixed company or in front of kids without causing offense. It shows up in cheap paperbacks and post-war comics, the language of respectable frustration. It mattered because rural Canada had a different relationship with propriety. Teachers, church folks, and community leaders all needed ways to express frustration without scandalizing the neighbors. What in blazes gave them that outlet? It died because the register is completely dated now. Nobody under 70 talks like a character from a Western paperback anymore. The phrase sounds theatrical, performative. Modern swearing is blunt or ironic. There's no room for blazes in either mode. It exists now only as a period detail, something you'd write into a historical drama to establish that someone's old-fashioned. Jiminy Cricket, Sunday afternoon, your grandmother's living room, 1970. She's watching CBC, and something on the news surprises her. Jiminy Cricket, she says, hand to her chest. You remember wondering who Jiminy is and why he's a cricket. This was American-born language that traveled north through radio and film, particularly Disney. Older Canadians picked it up as a polite release valve, something cute and clean that expressed surprise without any religious or profane undertones. It was grandparent language, something borrowed but adapted into Canadian middle-class speech. It mattered because it was safe for everyone. Kids could say it, grandparents could say it, teachers could say it. It lived in that narrow band of expressions that crossed generational lines without causing problems. It vanished because it feels like 1950s storybook language. TV standards relaxed, so euphemisms weren't necessary anymore. The phrase became associated with a very specific kind of wholesome mid-century culture that doesn't exist anymore. Saying Jiminy Cricket now marks you as either very old or very sarcastic. There's no earnest use left. Gosh darn small-town Alberta, hardware store, 1977, a farmer's trying to find a part for his combine. The clerk can't locate it in the back. Gosh darn it, the farmer mutters, not quite angry but definitely annoyed. The clerk nods sympathetically. They're both speaking the same language. This was rural and Western Canada's minced oath, a cousin to goddamn that kept things family-friendly. It shows up in cowboy paperbacks and CBC radio dramas, the lingua franca of prairie life. It's the kind of language people used when they were frustrated but still wanted to be respectable. It mattered because small-town Canada had eyes everywhere. Everyone knew everyone, so you couldn't just swear openly without it getting back to your wife or your pastor. Gosh darn gave you plausible deniability, while still letting everyone know you were upset. It died because it carried a cornball stigma by the 90s. Urban Canada started setting linguistic trends, and rural expressions got coded as backwards or unsophisticated. Younger speakers dropped it intentionally to sound less country. The phrase survives now mostly in parody or in pockets of rural Canada where older speech patterns hang on, but it's functionally extinct in everyday use. For Pete's sake! Your mom's car stuck in traffic on the DVP, 1986. The guy in front keeps hitting his brakes for no reason. For Pete's sake! Your mom yells at the windshield. You're in the back seat wondering who Pete is and why we're doing things for his sake. This was substitute swearing, a way to invoke frustration without invoking saints, God, or Christ directly. It worked everywhere: kitchens, classrooms, curling clubs, grocery store lineups. It was the sonic equivalent of a deep sigh and an eye roll. It mattered because it was universal. Every province, every class background, every age group over 30 knew this phrase and used it. It was the great equalizer of mild Canadian frustration. It disappeared because it became grandparent voice. Once a phrase gets coded as generationally specific, younger speakers abandon it to differentiate themselves. By the time millennials were adults, for Pete's sake sounded like something from a black and white sitcom. Meme culture favors sharper, funnier one-liners. There's no room for Pete anymore. Son of a gun, the ferry dock in Victoria, 1974. Your uncle runs into an old Navy buddy he hasn't seen in years. Son of a gun, he yells, slapping the guy on the back. It's surprise, delight, and nostalgia, all wrapped in one old-timey phrase. This phrase has naval origins, supposedly from when sailors would smuggle women aboard and babies would occasionally be born on deck near the guns. True or not, it stuck as a PG-rated exclamation. Canadian kids in the 60s and 70s copied it from TV dubs and Saturday matinee westerns. It was cowboy language, sailor language, adventure story language. It mattered because it felt grown up without being inappropriate. Kids could say it without getting scolded. It carried a whiff of old-fashioned masculinity and adventure. It died because it read as camp by the 90s, too theatrical, too performative. Real surprise got expressed more directly or more sarcastically. Son of a gun became something people only said if they were doing a bit or quoting an old movie. The earnest use evaporated. Crikey Moses, your British immigrant neighbor in Winnipeg, 1969. His lawnmower won't start. Crikey, he mutters, yanking the pull cord again. Your dad, watching from the porch, cracks a smile. That's not how Canadians swear, but it's close enough. This was Commonwealth language that occasionally showed up in Canada via British immigration and CBC's British programming imports. It's more Australian and British than Canadian, but it popped up enough in border cities and immigrant communities to register as familiar. It mattered briefly because post-war immigration brought new linguistic flavors. For a generation, you'd hear a mix of British, European, and North American expressions in the same neighborhood, the same workplace, the same school. It vanished because by the 80s, Canadian linguistic identity became more assertive. We weren't British, we weren't American, we were something else. Crikey got marked as too British for Canadian self-image. It survives only as an obvious import or as part of someone's personal family language legacy. Sacrus, you're watching CBC 1976. A Quebecois character in a drama gets angry and mutters something that sounds like tabernacle. The English subtitles say expletive. You ask your dad what it means. He says it's a French swear word, church stuff. Very bad in Quebec. You store that information away, fascinated. Quebec profanity is built from Catholic liturgy. Tabernacle, calice, chalice, hostie, host, Christ, sacrament, ciboire, ciborium. These aren't translations of English swears. They're uniquely Quebecois, rooted in the province's complicated relationship with the Catholic Church especially post-Quiet Revolution. Wikipedia documents them as among the strongest profanities in Quebec French, tied directly to church politics and cultural identity. They mattered because they represented a completely different swearing system. Anglophone Canadians knew about them, could recognize them, understood they were serious business, but rarely used them. They were famous across Canada as Quebec's thing, something that made the province linguistically and culturally distinct. They vanished from Anglophone air because broadcast standards avoided explicit French sacres. Outside Quebec, they were known more than used. English Canada had its own mild oaths. We didn't need to borrow Quebec's, and doing so felt like appropriation or mockery. The sacres stayed in their cultural lane, known nationally but not adopted. Holy mackerel! Saturday morning cartoons, Your Basement, 1982. Bugs Bunny pulls another impossible trick. Holy mackerel! Yells the villain. You repeat it, testing how it sounds. It's silly. It's perfect. This was fish-flavored euphemism, possibly connected to anti-Catholic mackerel snapper slurs, repurposed into a harmless shock expression. It shows up in pulp fiction, radio serials, and early kids programming. Harmless enough for broadcast, weird enough to be memorable. It mattered because it was cartoonish in the best way. It worked for kids, it worked for adults trying to keep things light. It lived in the space between serious swearing and just making sounds. It died because by the 90s, it sounded too corny. Irony replaced earnest exclamation. Saying holy mackerel marked you as hopelessly out of touch or trying way too hard to be family-friendly. It retreated into pure nostalgia territory, something people remember from old cartoons but would never actually say. Which one hit you hardest? Which one did you hear at home, at the rink, in your grandfather's garage? Drop your memories below, eh? And if you love this dive into forgotten Canadian life, subscribe for more nostalgia with receipts, because somebody's got to remember when swearing had guardrails and Canada had its own way of saying it.